What if I told you that the oldest Best Actor nominee in Academy history spent 4 decades tumbling off horses so other men could take the applause? That Hollywood's most beloved cowboy didn't utter his first real line of dialogue on screen until he was nearly 60 years old? And that this same soft-spoken man who once steered a lawn mower across 240 miles of Iowa farmland for a movie role would end his own life with a single gunshot on a ranch in New Mexico just 6 months after standing before the entire industry at the Oscars. This is the story of Richard Farnsworth, a stable hand who transformed into an invisible legend, a stuntman who outlived every star he ever doubled for, and an actor who proved that the longest wait can produce the most extraordinary performance of all. Number 1. The boy who lost everything but the horses. Richard William Farnsworth entered the world on September 1st, 1920 in Los Angeles, California. His father worked as an engineer, his mother kept the household, and for 7 brief years, life looked about as unremarkable as it gets for a boy growing up in America. Then his father passed away. Just like that, 7-year-old Richard found himself surrounded by women, and his mother, his aunt, and 2 sisters, all crammed into a household in downtown Los Angeles during the worst economic collapse the country had ever seen. There was no cushion of money, there was no safety net waiting to catch them, and there was no father left to show him what it meant to grow into a man. But there were horses Richard picked up riding at age 10. And something inside him shifted. The boy who floundered in every classroom discovered that on horseback he needed no textbooks, no lectures, no teachers standing over him. He needed only balance, nerve, and grit. By 15, he had abandoned high school for good and taken a position as a stable boy at a polo barn in Los Angeles, shoveling stalls and exercising horses for $5 a week. $5 a week in 1935. That was the whole of his world. Then, in 1937, Paramount Pictures ran an advertisement in the Los Angeles newspaper. They needed 200 riders for a picture called Marco Polo. The pay was $7 a day, staggering money for a kid who had been scraping by on $5 a week. Richard Farnsworth answered that ad. He rode for 5 straight weeks, and when the paychecks arrived, this 17-year-old former stable boy had earned enough to purchase his very first car. He had no way of knowing he'd just stumbled into a career that would stretch on for 63 years. But what would happen once the cameras finally turned toward his face instead of his horse? Number 2. 500 Mongolian riders and a career forged in dust. Richard's first appearance on screen came in 1938's The Adventures of Marco Polo, starring Gary Cooper. His job was straightforward. He was one of 500 extras dressed as Mongolian horsemen, thundering across the Paramount backlot in leather armor and fur caps. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared to learn it. He was simply a body atop a horse, and that summed up the entire assignment. But Farnsworth could ride like almost no one else on that lot. He could fall convincingly. He could brawl from the saddle. He could switch horses mid-gallop without breaking stride. The stunt coordinators took notice. The assistant directors took notice. And slowly, one uncredited gig at a time, the former stable boy became one of Hollywood's most dependable horsemen. By 1937, he had already appeared in the Marx Brothers' A-Day at the races. By 1939, he was performing horse stunts in Gunga Din. That same year, he took part in the sprawling production of Gone with the Wind, galloping through battle scenes that would become some of the most unforgettable images in movie history. And Richard Farnsworth received credit for none of it. He wasn't billed as an actor. He wasn't even named as a stuntman. He was a rider, a pair of steady hands, a dependable seat that directors could rely on whenever they needed someone to charge through flames, leap from a moving wagon, or take a spill that would send a lesser horseman straight to the hospital. The paycheck beat the polo barn by a mile. But fame, recognition, those belonged to the men whose faces filled the close-ups. So, what happened when one studio decided this nameless rider was worth keeping around for good? Number 3, the only man Roy Rogers trusted on his horse. By the mid-1940s, Richard Farnsworth had become the reliable stunt double at Republic Studios, the factory churning out westerns, serials, and B-pictures faster than any other lot in Hollywood. His most important client was the king of the cowboys himself, Roy Rogers. For nearly a decade, Farnsworth served as Rogers' sole stuntman and stand-in. Every time Roy Rogers leapt off a balcony, crashed through a saloon window, or absorbed a punch that sent him flying over a hitching post, that was really Richard Farnsworth. Every treacherous horse stunt, every fight sequence demanding genuine athleticism, Farnsworth handled it all. And here's the detail that captures exactly how Hollywood operated back then. Farnsworth sometimes earned a bigger paycheck than the actors he was doubling for. The stunt work carried so much danger, demanded such specialized skill, that the man invisible to the audience sometimes out-earned the man whose name sat on the marquee. But Roy Rogers was far from his only star. Over the following 3 decades, Farnsworth doubled for Kirk Douglas, Henry Fonda, Montgomery Clift, Gary Cooper, Steve McQueen, and Guy Madison. He stood in for Madison across the entire run of the 1950s television series Wild Bill Hickok, then again for The Legend of the Lone Ranger in theaters. He drove a chariot in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments in 1956. He doubled Henry Fonda in Anthony Mann's The Tin Star in 1957. He rode and brawled alongside Charlton Heston in a Pony Express picture, switching horses at a full gallop, a stunt so perilous that one miscalculation meant a broken neck. 300 films, 3 decades, and Richard Farnsworth remained a ghost. But was there one role that would finally push him past the edge of anonymity? Number 4. 11 months in a gladiator skirt on the Universal backlot. In 1960, Stanley Kubrick was shooting Spartacus at Universal Studios. The production was massive, thousands of extras, months of filming, some of the most elaborate battle sequences ever staged for an American picture. Richard Farnsworth was brought on as a stunt gladiator. He spent 11 months on the Universal backlot in a short Roman tunic, brawling in arena scenes and riding horses through the slave revolt sequences. He later joked about it, grinning through what was clearly years of frustration. For 16 months, I wore this short little skirt with my bony knees knocking on the backlot of Universal. I looked about as much like a gladiator as my granddaughter, but I held my own. The film swept 4 Academy Awards. Farnsworth received no credit whatsoever, but Spartacus taught him something crucial, and the stunt community had no organization, no collective voice, no formal channel to fight for safety or fair pay music. In 1961, Farnsworth funneled that frustration into action. He co-founded the Stunt Men's Association of Motion Pictures, an organization built around the rights, safety, and working conditions of Hollywood's most invisible workforce. It marked the first time Richard Farnsworth had ever attached his name to something meaningful within the industry. Not as a writer, not as a double, but as a leader who understood that the men and women risking their lives for other people's close-ups deserved far better treatment. His uncredited stunt work carried on through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Blazing Saddles, Papillon, The Outlaw, Josie Wales. He worked under John Ford, Howard Hawks, Sam Peckinpah, and nearly every major Western director in Hollywood history. But after almost 40 years spent in the shadows, could a man approaching 60 possibly reinvent himself as something greater than a body double? Number 5. The Man Who Refused to Curse. Here's something worth understanding about Richard Farnsworth before we reach what came next. This wasn't a man merely playing a cowboy. This was an actual cowboy. He competed on the professional rodeo circuit from the late 1930s through 1946, riding broncs and roping cattle for prize money whenever film work ran dry. He married Margaret Maggie Hill in 1947, and together they raised 2 children. A son named Diamond, who followed his father into stunt work and eventually became a respected stunt coordinator on shows like Quantum Leap and NCIS, and a daughter named Missy. Farnsworth lived on ranches his entire adult life. He rode horses daily, right up until his body could no longer manage it, and he carried himself with a quiet, old-fashioned dignity that Hollywood found practically impossible to fabricate. He once told Roger Ebert something that captured exactly who he was. "I've never had to curse in a movie, and I'm not about to start now." Across more than 60 films with speaking roles, 0 profanity. In an industry that thrived on shock and edge, Farnsworth simply refused to bend on a principle most people would have surrendered after their very first audition. By the mid-1970s, Farnsworth reached a decision. His body was breaking down after decades of falls, brawls, and horse wrecks. He could no longer sustain the physical toll. So, at roughly age 55, he retired from stunt work altogether and began chasing speaking roles exclusively. His first meaningful part arrived in 1976, the stagecoach driver in The Duchess and the Dirtwater Fox, a comedy western starring Goldie Hawn and George Segal. It was a modest role, but for the first time in nearly 4 decades, Richard Farnsworth's face and voice were the point, not his ability to tumble off a horse without shattering his spine. Could a 56-year-old former stuntman with 0 formal acting training actually convince Hollywood he belonged in front of the camera? Number 6. The Oscar nomination nobody saw coming in 1978, director Alan J. Pakula cast Richard Farnsworth in Comes a Horseman, a drama set in the 1940s American West, starring Jane Fonda and James Caan. Farnsworth played Dodger, an aging hard-working ranch hand and quiet father figure to Fonda's stubborn rancher character. The role demanded no stunts, no horse tricks, no falls. It demanded something Farnsworth had never once been asked to deliver across 40 years of Hollywood work: emotion, and what this anonymous stuntman produced stunned everyone who witnessed it. Farnsworth's performance as Dodger felt so natural, so deeply authentic, that critics couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. This wasn't acting. This was a real cowboy, simply being a real cowboy, and the camera couldn't look away. On April 9th, 1979, at the 51st Academy Awards, Richard Farnsworth was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. He was 58 years old, he had been working in Hollywood since 1937, and an industry that had treated him as invisible for 4 straight decades suddenly realized it had been overlooking one of the most genuine performers in its history. He lost the Oscar to Christopher Walken for The Deer Hunter, but he took home the National Board of Review Award and shared the National Society of Film Critics Award for Best Supporting Actor. The production itself carried its own tragedy. On August 18, 1977, while filming near Canyon City, Colorado, stuntman Jim Shepard, a stand-in for Jason Robards, was killed performing a stunt that required him to be dragged by a horse through a wooden gate. The scene appears in the finished film, cut just before the moment of the fatal accident. For Farnsworth, a man who had spent his entire career performing exactly that kind of work, Shepard's death served as a stark reminder of what he had survived and what so many of his colleagues had not. He had proven he could act, but could anyone genuinely build a leading career starting at age 60? Number 7. The Gentleman Bandit Who Changed Everything. In 1982, a 29-year-old Canadian director named Philip Borzos offered Farnsworth the role of a lifetime. The film was The Grey Fox, the true story of Bill Miner, a gentleman stagecoach robber released from San Quentin after 33 years behind bars. Bewildered by the modern world, Miner wanders into a movie theater, watches the great train robbery, and gets an idea. He begins robbing trains across British Columbia, becoming a folk hero along the way. Farnsworth wasn't the first choice. Harry Dean Stanton had originally been cast, and advertisements had already gone out bearing his name. But Stanton withdrew to star in Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart, and Farnsworth stepped into the role. It turned out to be a decision that reshaped Canadian cinema. The Grey Fox was made for roughly $4.5 million. It grossed over $5.5 million. It won 7 Genie Awards, Canada's equivalent of the Oscars, including Best Actor for Farnsworth. He also claimed the London Film Critics Circle Actor of the Year, tied with James Mason, and picked up a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Drama. The film holds a rare 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and as Roger Ebert observed, it marked Richard Farnsworth's first true starring role at age 62. Let that sink in. The man had spent 44 years in Hollywood before anyone trusted him to carry an entire film, and when they finally did, he delivered a performance so flawless, it became a landmark of an entire nation's cinema. But fame at 62 arrives with a cruel asterisk. How many years did he truly have left to enjoy what he'd finally earned? Number 8, The Quiet Man Who Stole Every Scene. The Grey Fox pried open doors that had stayed locked for 4 decades. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Farnsworth became one of Hollywood's most beloved character actors. The man directors called whenever they needed someone who could walk onto a set and make every other performer look like they were merely pretending. In 1984, he played Red Blow, the assistant coach and quiet conscience of Robert Redford's mythical slugger in The Natural. In 1985, he played Matthew Cuthbert, the shy, gentle adoptive father of Anne Shirley in the Canadian miniseries Anne of Green Gables, a performance that won him a Gemini Award and cemented his reputation as the most natural actor of his generation. In 1990, Rob Reiner cast him as Sheriff Buster in Misery, the kindly lawman investigating James Caan's disappearance, who is murdered by Kathy Bates' Annie Wilkes. The character didn't even exist in Stephen King's novel. Reiner invented him specifically because he needed someone whose death would devastate the audience. The film grossed over $61 million. He appeared in The Two Jakes, Havana, The Getaway, Lassie, and dozens of other films. He held a role in the landmark miniseries Roots in 1977, and out in the Pacific Northwest, he became unexpectedly famous as the groundskeeper who spots the mythical artisans in the Olympia beer commercials, a campaign that ran for years. On August 17, 1992, Richard Farnsworth received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 1560 Vine Street. In 1997, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. The stable boy who once mucked stalls for $5 a week now had his name pressed into concrete on Hollywood Boulevard. But on October 7, 1998, something happened that would redefine the final chapter of his life. And the story begins with a phone call from the most unlikely director in America. What did David Lynch see in a 78-year-old retired cowboy that nobody else could have imagined? Number 9, 240 miles on a lawn mower. Remember that lawn mower from the beginning of this story? Here's where it finally matters. In 1994, a 73-year-old Iowa man named Alvin Strait learned that his brother Lyle had suffered a stroke. He connected to the character on a level that went far beyond performance. Like Alvin, Farnsworth walked with 2 canes due to deteriorating hips. Like Alvin, he was a man running out of time. What the crew didn't fully grasp during filming was that Farnsworth was dying. Metastatic prostate cancer had spread through his bones and into his spine. On certain days, the pain grew so severe he could barely stand. The production had to work around his physical limitations, but when the cameras rolled, Farnsworth delivered line readings of such quiet, devastating power that the entire set would fall silent. On February 15, 2000, Richard Farnsworth was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. At 79 years and 167 days old, he became the oldest person ever nominated in that category, a record that stood for 21 years. He won the New York Film Critics Circle Award. He won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Male Lead. At the 72nd Academy Awards on March 26, 2000, host Billy Crystal singled him out from the stage, calling it wonderful to see him and describing his nomination as one of the great stories of the evening. Farnsworth lost the Oscar to Kevin Spacey for American Beauty, but something far more significant was unfolding behind that weathered smile. What was the secret Richard Farnsworth was keeping from nearly everyone in that auditorium? Number 10, The Cowboy's Last Ride. Remember the gunshot from the beginning of this story? This is the moment that finally explains it. By the summer of 2000, Richard Farnsworth's cancer had grown unbearable. The disease that had quietly ravaged his body throughout the filming of the Strait story had spread through his bones and into his spine. He was partially paralyzed. The pain never let up, and the man who had spent 63 years proving he could survive any fall, endure any stunt, withstand any hardship, understood that this was the one fight he could not win. On the evening of October 6, 2000, 1 month and 5 days after his 80th birthday, and exactly 6 months after his final night at the Academy Awards, Richard Farnsworth ended his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound at his ranch in Lincoln, New Mexico. His fiancée, Julie Van Valen, was present at the home. Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan confirmed it was self-inflicted. Van Valen later said that Farnsworth knew he was riddled with cancer and simply decided it was time. He did not want to become a burden to the people he loved. And here is the detail that haunts everyone who learns this story. 20 years earlier, in 1980, Farnsworth had appeared in Tom Horn alongside Steve McQueen. He played rancher John C. Coble, the man who defended the real Tom Horn's innocence. The film closes with a quote attributed to the real Coble, defending Horn to the very end. That quote was lifted straight from John C. Coble's own suicide note. Richard Farnsworth played a man who took his own life, and 20 years later, facing that same kind of unendurable suffering, he made the identical choice. Whether he remembered that connection in his final hours, nobody will ever know. He is buried beside his wife Maggie at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills. She had passed away on August 7, 1985, after 38 years of marriage. In death, the two of them are together once again. Richard Farnsworth spent 63 years working in Hollywood. He appeared in over 300 films. He doubled for the biggest stars of the 20th century. He co-founded an organization that safeguarded the lives of the men and women who performed the industry's most dangerous work. He never cursed on screen. He never compromised on who he was. And when Hollywood finally looked him in the face, it discovered one of the greatest natural performers in the history of American cinema. He waited 40 years for his moment, and when it finally arrived, he proved he had been ready all along. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and join us next time, because the golden age of Hollywood is still full of cowboys who deserved far more time in the spotlight.